say is at a crucial stage. It's not because of foreign wars we wage. It's more to do with the colors blue and red. Too many laws and too much government. Can you tell me where the Constitution went? The Bill of Rights is just hanging by a thread. So many people try to cross the border. Politicians build a new world order. Too many minds are convinced they should be led. I've gotta be free the way God made men. And I won't be ruled by the damn UN. Taking your right to self-defense. They say you're safer but they don't make sense. Dangerous ones will not turn into guns. All the unions always ask for more. All we buy is made on foreign shores. Come a day when there'll be real hell to pay. I've gotta be free the way God made men. And I won't be ruled by the damn UN. Damn UN.
Hello and welcome to today's broadcast of Tap Into the Truth. With you as always, I'm your ever so humble host, Tim Tapp, coming to you live from historic Roane County, Tennessee. Hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are and whatever you may be doing, with all of the usual caveats, of course. For those of you listening at KYAH 540 AM, hope you're having a great Saturday morning. And remember, you can hear me again tomorrow, Sunday morning, 10 to noon. I will be back. In the meanwhile, just as an FYI, this show is typically recorded live on Wednesday nights. However, I had a plethora of technical issues. I kept getting booted out of my own show. And unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do about it. So I'm basically recording the whole thing over again, and I'll be replacing the audio. So for those of you who are wondering what happened to the previous, or those of you who've already listened to the show as it was archived previously, thank you. And if you're wondering what happened, this is it. Meanwhile, I also want to thank Chief from Simple Facts of Life. That is a show that he hosts, for attempting to step in rather short notice to try and help cover some dead air that was a result. Certainly appreciate his efforts. And for those of you who would like to hear what he did, I will tack that on at the very end. You'll be able to listen to that as bonus material. Now, those of you who are listening to KYAH 540 AM, Utah's Talk Authority, you won't be able to hear that. But all you have to do is either track down this show at Spreaker.com or at blogtalkradio.com, or you can find me at iHeart Radio, Spotify, iTunes, the whole nine, because I'm going to set this up so that it goes out archived again, and you will hear that at the end. But keep in mind, he really wasn't prepared, and we were still having technical glitches. And he just stepped up, and he did as good of a job as just about anybody could without really being prepared. But I want to thank him very much. Thank you, Chief, for stepping up and making sure I didn't have just dead air going out while the show was supposed to be live. I certainly appreciate that. And as a thank you and a hat tip, I will leave your part in at the end of the show. It's a bonus as a simple thank you because I want to make sure that content is preserved and included at the end of this broadcast. All right. While I'm at it, let me go ahead and thank the folks who were in the chat room when the show was live and they were listening in. I want to thank Mary and Chief and Gary Comforter from Canada and Kel, my Canadian friend as well, host of Red Fox Blogger Radio and Infidels Are Watching. Bigfoot, it's got a great blog. And Bringing It Boy joined us in. And I think there was someone else who had stopped in, but I didn't catch them before they bounced out. But I want to thank them as well, so I certainly don't mean to leave anyone out. In the meanwhile, I'm going to try and cover the same topics that I covered initially, or had planned to cover, but didn't get to. So this is going to be kind of tough for me, just because now more stuff has happened that I want to talk about. But I'm going to save that for a later broadcast. So sit back, relax, and be ready to listen as we tap into the truth and basically do a little time traveling as we go back to Wednesday night and try to recapture a little bit of radio magic. All right. Excuse me. All right, here's where we started out with. There's a lot of stuff going on right now, obviously. I'm sure one of the future headlines we're about to see is Trump fails to stop hurricane. And, of course, we have Brett Kavanaugh, who went through a Democratic firestorm as they were all grandstanding. And one of the things I'd like to remind everyone is that I was visited by Mr. Kevin Ring, who happens to be the president of FAMM, Families Against Mandatory Sentencing. And we discussed Kavanaugh because he's also the author of the book Scalia's Court. So I will be playing that interview again a little later. It was live at the time. But in the meanwhile, we'll come back to that. I'm going to just jump right in with one of our social justice warrior stories. Obviously, we talk a lot about the culture wars, at least we do now. I remember when I started out, I talked a lot about policy. Now, I talk more about the culture war, and for good reason. We have talked quite a bit recently about Teen Vogue. Why? Well, because they've been laying out the roadmap for tweens to be getting involved with sexuality questions that are still best left for older people. At any rate, they, at the very least, moved away from the sex topic. However, I'm not real sure that things got any better. I mean, seriously, on the one hand, maybe we should kind of be happy that Teen Vogue has fully transitioned away from providing detailed guides on the mechanics of anal sex to the tween crowd. But they made the transition to promoting violent opposition to fascism. See, on the other hand, though, when I think about it, there really is a lot of space between the two topics. I mean, Teen Vogue literally could have covered just about anything else, but here we are. Over this past weekend, Teen Vogue took on the timely and pressing topic of anti-fascism, the cultural significance of anarchy, and how high schoolers can get involved with their local black-clad resistance. You know, should they decide that simply tweeting about President Trump is proving ineffectual. Not that Antifa has really scored many points in that direction either, but I digress. The guide, authored by a New York City anarchist and buried between think pieces on Ariana Grande and skincare for the acne-ravaged, begins by setting out a definition of anarchy that, well, sounds a little bit something like, well, let's just say it doesn't really sound like anarchy. Quote, anarchism, which I guess is a real word now, anarchism is a radical, revolutionary, leftist political philosophy that advocates for the abolition of government. So we're going to just abolish government. They're out to abolish government. They're out to abolish the hierarchy and basically all other unequal systems of power. Now, the New York City anarchist was female, by the way, and she continues writing, saying, quote, "It seeks to replace what its proponents view as inherently oppressive, let me enunciate clearly, inherently oppressive institutions like a capitalist society or the prison industry or, whatever may be an institution of authority. And they want to replace it with non-hierarchical, horizontally structured, powered by, voluntary associations between people." Now, that's the definition she's offering up. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like being an anarchist. That sounds like being a socialist. They're trying to get rid of the capitalist society, and they seem to think that you literally can be okay just with voluntary associations between people. Although what's really funny is anytime conservatives try to assert a right to voluntarily associate, business or otherwise, with people they're choosing, somehow that becomes bigoted behavior. Sometimes I think they should pay attention to the words they use. Anyway, continuing back to their definition, most of all, anarchists in the vein of Antifa are opposed to anything that isn't totally intersectional. And the ones that this particular author associates with views themselves, well, of course, radically socialist. Surprise, surprise. Now, her form of anarchism, it involves a vast collective where no one owns any personal property, and the people engaged in community ownership of the means of production. Isn't that how farms fail to produce food and businesses fail to produce product? I'm just asking the question. Anyway, the only real difference between anarchism and communism, according to the author, is that communism requires that a small group still be in control of the vast collective, whereas under anarchy, everyone has an equal part in the governance of everything, which, of course, belongs to everyone. Now, if that sounds a little confusing and perhaps even a bit ineffectual, that might be because it is. But really, that doesn't matter, because anarchy doesn't really lend itself to organization. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of organization. I mean, when you think about it, it kind of sort of makes overthrowing the bourgeois difficult, if you can't actually organize. Fortunately, however, for the author, she's also actively involved in the pro-labor movement, which is weirdly anti-anarchical. So she's really tapping into the best of both worlds, even if she happens to be a walking example of irony. Now, the piece wraps up much like Teen Vogue's other explainers, by suggesting that dabbling in anarchy doesn't just have to be a punk rock phase that you go through on your way to getting a real job and paying taxes and laying aside your youthful hatred of collective fantasies. The page then quickly shifts over to why Rowan Blanchard wants to bleach her eyebrows. In fairness, though, eyebrow bleaching is pretty punk rock. Okay, so can we seriously discuss for just a second or two what in the name of all that's holy in heaven is going on at Teen Vogue? It's bad enough that we have literally had to deal with them giving guides on anal sex. It's bad enough we've had to deal with them sitting back and telling the world about how it's unacceptable to believe anything other than intersectionality is the future. That there is no room for anyone who might not wish to participate in something like a same-sex wedding. You know, little things like conscience and religious liberty. These are antiquated terms that mean nothing. Because after all, when it comes to the left and what they believe, well, the only rights that matter are their rights. They fail to understand that their rights end where the next person's rights begin, and vice versa. And, you know, I really do lament the days when we used to hear people actually say that aloud. Folks used to say that a lot out loud. I remember hearing it quite frequently when I was younger. So far, the last person I've heard say that was me. And it was still a little while back. I'm trying to say it a little more often because I think it's a good reminder. The folks on the left need to understand that rights are not a one-way street. We all, as citizens of this nation, have certain guaranteed protective rights. And then all of us as human beings have general human rights. To have human rights, however, does not mean that you have constitutional protections. Only citizens have those. And generally speaking, you must be an adult citizen in order to truly have full expectation of your rights. So how is it exactly that Teen Vogue gets to continue to market their smut and their leftist agenda propaganda to our tweens and teens? Well, free speech, of course. They have the right to express themselves, and they have the right to print these ridiculous articles, and they can market it to whomever they like. So like it or not, Teen Vogue is out there. And ultimately, it's up to us to actually step up and be parents as best we can, giving a good shining example of what it means to be an American, to give our children those necessary lectures about what it takes to be a good person in general, to find a moral compass, and to understand your role in being a good citizen. And also, let's teach them some critical thinking while we're at it. After all, the school system, especially the public school system in particular, they certainly no longer do it. In fact, we're trapped. We're trapped in a situation now where perfectly well-meaning teachers are pushing a leftist agenda and indoctrinating our children in earlier and earlier grades because they themselves were indoctrinated in college and probably don't even understand that, oh, well, you were indoctrinated, not educated, and now you're doing the same thing because that's what you think education is. Now, again, before I start getting hate emails and the like, understand I'm not trashing all teachers. There are a lot of great teachers out there, and they're doing the best they can. It's a tough job, and unfortunately, leftists are making it even tougher. There's a lot of teachers out there that absolutely hate the curriculum they have, but they have no choice. It's the only curriculum that's offered, and they either do that or they don't get to have any influence on the children. So they keep fighting the good fight while still being forced to teach a curriculum that is less about education and more about indoctrination. So for those of you, for those great teachers out there who are doing the best job you can under terrible circumstances, well, I salute you and good luck for the future. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. I asked a question in the show title. How far will the left go to protest Trump? And I asked that question because for the love of Pete, on Wednesday, this story was just making the rounds, and it's still out there. There's this professor, he's a college professor, for crying out loud, who took that next step, that next evolutionary step in virtue signaling, and literally shot himself with a .22 pistol in the arm to protest Donald J. Trump. Now, he's a sociology professor at the College of Southern Nevada. The professor's wounds were not life-threatening, but he does face multiple charges for bringing the gun onto campus and carrying out the protests. Now, according to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, they report, and I will quote from them, that Professor Mark J. Bird shot himself in the bathroom on campus, then stumbled out bleeding before he collapsed. According to the report, Bird taped a $100 bill to the mirror prior to shooting himself as a tip to the janitor for cleaning up the mess. So at least he's a thoughtful idiot. He's a useful idiot for the left. And he's a thoughtful idiot. He's like, nah, guys, I've got to do this. I've got to shoot myself in the arm to prove. What point are you proving by shooting yourself in the arm, other than the fact that you're a freaking moron? Yet this is the kind of guy that I was just talking about, that's indoctrinating our kids in college, university, that's now indoctrinating the next generation of teachers to the point that, well, that's what we do. Shot himself in the arm. What level of virtue signaling are you reaching? Although he does seem to have lost sight of a couple of important leftist ideas. You know, like disarming the American public in the first place. Because he had a gun. Oh, yeah. And he took that gun to a gun-free zone. Proving again exactly what conservatives have been saying for a long time about the effectiveness of gun-free zones. If you're a criminal with bad intentions, sticking up a sign or a placard isn't going to stop you from carrying out an act of violence. It's just not. I mean, in theory, it'd be great if it did, but it's not. And this guy's supposed to be part of the staff. And he didn't even plan on carrying out an act of violence against other people. And technically, it's not even violence against himself because he wanted it. But he still isn't supposed to have the gun there. But I still just get a little bit of a twinge of a chuckle when I think about the fact that he taped up a $100 bill. Want to make sure the janitor got it. Even though, quite honestly, there's no way he has of making sure the janitor gets that $100 bill once he has to be taken off to the hospital, for crying out loud. Anyway, Bird was hired by the college back in 1993. And according to the police report on the incident, they noted that Bird said that he had shot himself in protest of President Donald Trump. Bird, as I mentioned, he violated a few rules. He faces charges for firing a gun in a gun-free zone. Yay, that's a crime. And he's going to face a penalty for it. Firing a gun in a gun-free zone. And also for carrying a concealed weapon without a permit and possessing a dangerous weapon on school property. Now, these are all leftist ideas, leftist pushed agenda, and yet he's completely willing to break all those rules to make the point. So he can make the ultimate virtue signal. He's willing to shoot himself. Now, I can't help but make light of the story a little bit, but what concerns me is this really is the next step in virtue signaling evolution. Which means now we're literally just a little bit further away from people shooting themselves in a fashion that will be life-threatening. This obviously wasn't. And evidently he knew enough to know where to shoot himself without running a serious risk. I mean, lots of times these people aren't gun people in the first place, usually. So he very well could have nicked an artery or a vein and put himself in way more danger than he had intended. Of course, then again, he's a nut job, and as far as we know, maybe he did intend to make a major statement by being at greater risk. I don't know about that. I can't attest to the guy's mindset other than the fact that he's definitely suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. So I don't know. I mean, I'm happy that he is going to have to stand up and face some kind of version of justice for what he did. I mean, it's reasonable. It's understandable. It should definitely happen. There's no question. There's no doubt. He committed a ridiculous act, all in the name of virtue signaling. And that's that. Not much else to say about it. Just virtue signal away, I suppose. All right. Making my way to the next story. There are several stories I wanted to get to. I was afraid I probably wouldn't get to all of them. Since I was originally scheduled for this broadcast to have two guests, and one unfortunately got held up in a meeting much longer than they had anticipated. That is actually going to give me an opportunity to get to a few more of these stories. So I will do exactly that. One of the things that I definitely wanted to talk about, though, is as it turns out, an Obama-appointed judge actually did something kind of pro-free speech, and more to the point, pro-gun free speech. Now, most of you by now, especially if you were watching the Kavanaugh hearings in particular, or if you've watched MSNBC or CNN when they've been looking for someone to step up and talk about who should be the next Democratic nominee for president, you're probably familiar with Kamala Harris. Now, what you may or may not know, depending on whether you're from the state of California or if you're really just a political junkie, is that Kamala Harris actually used to be the Attorney General for the state of California. So, she was involved with various litigation, as you would expect a Attorney General to be, especially in the state. And California, California, if you're not familiar, if you've only passed through, or if you've never had the chance to visit, I highly recommend you visiting California. It's a beautiful state, lots of beautiful places, lots of great farmland, awesome mountains, and of course the beaches are phenomenal. It's fantastic. I would stay away from San Francisco. There are parts of the city that are still beautiful, and you can tell it was at one time just an awesome place. Unfortunately, the politicians there have really, really let things go with the issues of the homeless folks and some of their ideas of how to help combat overdosing and drug addicts on the street. It's become a cesspool on the streets, unfortunately. It's a terrible thing because, like I said, it was a beautiful city, and parts of it still are. Parts of it still are. I mean, I want to give it its due. I don't want to knock it, but there's no question the so-called progressives and their policies have really run it into the ground, just like pretty much any other great American city that they've managed to have control of for a while. Detroit comes to mind. Chicago comes to mind. I mean, Chicago is still a beautiful city, but for crying out loud, there's more people killed there every freaking week in gun violence than there are guns in the state of Texas. Okay, it's a slight exaggeration. But the point is, in a place like Texas that does literally have so many more guns and so many fewer gun rules and gun control laws, why are there more people that die in a week than normally die in a year in Texas? Could it have something to do with those gun control laws? Could it have something to do with the fact that I don't know, that only the criminals end up having guns at that point, and violent criminals who will have a gun and know that you're not likely to be armed might be more likely to be violent with you? Just throwing some ideas out there. But at any rate, let me digress. This story is worth talking about because, first of all, it was an Obama appointee judge. But in a ruling that was handed down, enunciation still good, Tim. In a ruling handed down this past Monday, an Obama-appointed district court judge in California gave a hearty smackdown to the California Department of Justice in a First Amendment case pertaining to firearms-related speech. Now, the case, Tracy Rifle versus Harris, arose after Kamala Harris's Justice Department cited Tracy Rifle and Pistol for multiple other California gun dealers for illegally displaying advertisements for handguns in their place of business in violation of California Penal Code Section 28620. And for those of you who would like to know what California Penal Code Section 28620 says, well, here it is. No handgun or imitation handgun or placard advertising the sale or other transfer thereof shall be displayed in any part of the premises where it can readily be seen from the outside. Meaning you have to keep all that stuff so far inside nobody can just look in a window. Now, that's kind of asinine when you consider this next bit, and it is important to keep in mind. You see, there's no similar limitation on any other type of firearm advertising. So, as Judge Troy Nunley noted in the ruling, he said, quote, plaintiffs could display a large neon sign reading, "Guns, guns, guns." Or they could have a 15-foot depiction of a modern sporting rifle, and this would be permissible. And the stores could advertise handguns for sale in other ways, like on billboards a few blocks away, or in print or online advertising. All that's completely legal in California. You just can't have the gun or a picture of a gun or a placard. You can't even have a little BB gun or a toy gun insinuating that you could sell pistols where they can be seen from outside the building. It's ridiculous. And fortunately, some common sense prevailed in this case. You see, instead of spending their time doing, maybe making sure dangerous people aren't on the streets, instead of that, Kamala Harris and the California State DOJ sent out inspectors to cite gun stores for violations of this particular statute. Five separate stores, Tracy Rifle and Pistol, 10% Firearms, Sacramento Black Rifle, PRK Arms, and Imbert and Smithers, and individual plaintiffs all filed a federal civil rights case against the California DOJ. They did this back in 2015. And finally, this past Monday, let me reiterate the fact that it is 2018 now. This lawsuit started in 2015, 3 years later. But finally, this past Monday, Judge Troy Nunley, again, let me remind you, an Obama appointee, so I guess he surprised some folks, actually thought about the Constitution. Congratulations, Judge Nunley. You get a hat tip today. He ruled in the plaintiff's First Amendment rights were unlawfully infringed and enjoining the state from enforcing California Penal Code Section 28620. So, California can no longer go after gun shops for violating this law. It's basically been nullified. In the process, Judge Nunley eviscerated the arguments of Harris's minions and of the state's expert witnesses. If you're into constitutional law, you should pour yourself a beverage of your choice and enjoy. If a law restricts a constitutionally protected right, this is Nunley explaining in his ruling, such as commercial speech, there is a 4-part test to determine the law's constitutionality. First, the speech must concern lawful activity and not be misleading. So, this particular part is satisfied. Check. Then, the government has the burden of proving that it has a substantial interest, that the restriction directly advances that interest, and that the restriction is not more extensive than necessary to serve that interest. In this case, defendants were laughably unable to shoulder that burden. It was clear the state doesn't really have an interest here other than to try and prevent these businesses from letting potential customers know that they can buy firearms at a gun store. What a novel idea. Now, the California Department of Justice argued that their substantial interests were in reducing handgun suicide and reducing handgun crime, which, most places suicide is technically a crime. I know leftists typically think that it may just be a really late-term abortion or just euthanasia, which usually they're okay with as well. But it's still on the books, and I think California still has the law in place. You're really kind of breaking the law if you're attempting suicide. So I would make the argument that you don't even have to separate those two. But then again, maybe California has done something to separate it. Or maybe suicide's no longer illegal there. That is something I must profess I do not know. So, that was the argument. Our interest as a state is in reducing handgun crime. So the plaintiffs didn't dispute those interests. Then the DOJ had to prove that this restriction on speech, the prohibition of only handgun advertising, directly and materially advances the asserted government's interest. So now they're on the hook. They make their argument. They say, we're trying to stop handgun crime. Which if I was an attorney for the other side, is where I would point out that the overwhelming majority of handgun crime and gun crime of all kinds, whether it's a handgun or rifle or whatever, is typically perpetrated by weapons that have been illegally purchased, illegally acquired. Either, maybe they just stole it from somewhere. Very rarely are these weapons utilized in crimes when they have been legally acquired. Very rarely. Now, sometimes in a moment of passion where you've lost your mind in a certain set of circumstances, maybe you act rashly without thinking, especially if you have impulse control problems, and then maybe you commit an act of violence that you didn't really mean to do and ordinarily wouldn't have done, but, it's the gun you had, so it's the gun you used. But that's not the way actual criminals operate. That's individuals who've lost their head. So, they've made their statement, and now they have to somehow prove that this law, which is rather burdensome for the gun shops, directly and materially advances the assertion of the government interest. Absurdly, let me say that again, absurdly, the Department of Justice argued that this restriction directly and materially advanced the government's interest by inhibiting suicidal people who also have impulsive personality traits from purchasing a gun. Under their theory, and tell me if this makes any sense to you. I mean, once you look at it and use that awesome skill of critical thinking that so many victims of the public school system are coming out of without these days. Let's think about it. According to their theory, someone who's in a suicidal frame of mind but not quite ready to do something about it might, suddenly decide to go into a gun store and purchase a handgun if they can see a handgun from outside of the store, or if they can see written or photographic handgun advertising outside of the store. In addition, the California Department of Justice theory would also require one to believe that similar advertising about rifles or shotguns would not lead to such an impulse buy. So they literally painted themselves in a corner. They had to try and explain why it would work for a handgun, but doesn't really matter when it comes to a rifle. Pause for dramatic effect there. I mean, the level of stupidity, I'm sorry, there's just not a better word. The level of stupidity there is mind-numbing. I mean, we know Hollywood repeatedly asks people to suspend disbelief. It's the whole point of Hollywood. It's part of what I like about movies. But come on, guys. Seriously? This is your way of enforcing the law, and this is your argument? This is from a bad movie script. It's a little too far. We can't. I don't know anybody who could suspend belief long enough to buy into this. Anyway, there is another fly in Camilla's ointment as well. Another fly in the ointment, as they say. Even if such a buyer gave in to their impulsiveness there's a 10-day waiting period before you can, take possession of a newly purchased handgun. That's one of the laws in the state of California. So you literally can't legally acquire a handgun impulsively. You must maintain that impulsive mindset for at least 10 days. I mean, by that time, under the Department of Justice theory of how this moves their interests forward, the impulse should be gone, shouldn't it? I mean, it's 10 days. That's the whole point of having the 10-day waiting period. That's how they put that in place. It's to prevent people from impulsively buying handguns. Anybody else starting to wonder if Kamala Harris or anyone that was working in her Justice Department at the time actually knew California law or understood? I mean, I see her as a senator now, and I doubt that she knows federal law very well, based on how she acts. I might actually be more knowledgeable about federal law than she is. And she's technically supposed to be helping to shape it. I'm just saying. Anyway, so the government basically argued against itself when you think about it. They presented expert reports from psychologists stating that people with impulsive personality traits are at a higher risk for committing suicide. Okay, check. We follow that. And that suicide is the leading cause of death for purchasers in the year after purchasing a handgun. But that, on average, people who committed suicide with a handgun had possession of their weapon for 11 years or longer. I mean, that is 11 years. Think about that. That's a long time after that 10-day cooling off period. On average, people who committed suicide with a handgun had their weapon for 11 years before committing suicide. Now, though these expert witnesses, they were there and they testified at exactly the way this case was put together. But through these expert witnesses, the Department of Justice essentially argues that this truthful commercial speech must be restricted in order to protect impulsive people from themselves. Upon what scholarly studies did these esteemed intellectual giants rely? Well, here's a quote. The little evidence that Professor Gunderlock relies on to tie impulsive purchases to handguns includes a remark by a firearm manufacturer's executive during an earnings call, a passing mention in an industrial publication, and 2 commenters on firearms blogs. Have you ever been to a blog where they allow comments? Have you ever spent much time reading the comments? Sometimes you can find interesting information, interesting conversation. Sometimes helpful hints and tips can be offered up. But more often than not, you just get a special kind of cray-cray. Anyway, the professors also provided no evidence whatsoever showing that impulse buys of handguns were different than any other types of impulse purchases. Classic impulse buys are small dollar extras near the checkout at the grocery store. Typically not deadly weapons that cost hundreds of dollars. Most impulse buys are going to be relatively cheap, $20 or less. Very rarely do you run into a $600, an $800, a $1,200, an $1,800 impulse buy. It's just not very common. Still, even after all this so-called evidence, we're supposed to believe, all it really does is it argues against any need for California's 10-day waiting period. And, oddly enough, Judge Nunley kind of said that too. After listening, and then after listing reams of precedent to support his ruling, Nunley wrote the following. Precisely because bans against truthful, non-misleading commercial speech rarely seek to protect consumers from either deception or overreaching, they usually rest solely on the offensive assumption that the public will respond irrationally to the truth. For this reason, the First Amendment directs us to be especially skeptical of regulations that seek to keep people in the dark for what the government perceives to be their own good. The government may not seek to remove a popular but disfavored product from the marketplace by prohibiting truthful, non-misleading advertisements that contain impressive endorsements or catchy jingles. That the government finds expression too persuasive does not permit it to quiet the speech or to burden its messengers. Yet this is exactly what the government seeks to do. The government aims to stop a group of law-abiding adults with the shared personality trait of impulsiveness from making what it sees the bad decision of purchasing a handgun. The government believes it can inhibit such persons from making the initial decision to purchase a handgun. It will save them from the harming themselves or others with the handgun at some later date, likely years from the initial purchase. However, the government may not restrict speech that persuades adults who are neither criminals nor suffer from mental illness from purchasing a legal and constitutionally protected product merely because it distrusts their personality traits and the decision that personality trait may lead them to make later on down the road. Yeah, I'm wondering, and I'm thinking, thank goodness that this judge was able to put politics aside, put the leftist agenda aside, forget that he was put on the court to carry out the Obama legacy, and actually side with the Constitution and actually cite the Constitution properly in a ruling that he laid down. Just a special hat tip there. Nunley also noted that the Supreme Court has rejected this highly paternalistic approach. You know, I mean, and it really is kind of, well, we know what's best for you. You don't know what's best for you. So he points out that the Supreme Court's rejected the highly paternalistic approach to limiting speech, and that it has reiterated that the government cannot justify content burdens on speech based on the fear that people would make bad decisions if giving truthful information. In today's anti-code is free speech atmosphere, that's kind of a radical but certainly a welcome notion, at least as far as I'm concerned. Oh no, is free speech, or are they just dog whistling to a group of people? I mean, seriously, though, all kidding aside, it's rare enough for there to be a pro-gun ruling at any court in California, state or federal. But there are a few other key points in this ruling. And Brandon Combs, executive director of the Cal Guns Foundation, which is basically just California Guns abbreviation, you know. But anyway, there's one or two civil rights organizations supporting the case. Anyway, Brandon Combs' comment was as follows. Today, a Barack Obama-appointed federal judge issued a strong pro-free speech decision on the merits in a firearm-related federal lawsuit. That's something that many Republican-appointed judges haven't done. And the fact Judge Nunley correctly used the term modern sporting rifle to refer to semi-automatic firearms protected under the Second Amendment is both welcome and significant. You know, and that's a tremendous point. It's something that, unless you're a gun person, maybe you don't even notice that. I mean, we've seen the media constantly go, ooh, assault rifle, assault weapon, assault weapon. Modern sporting rifle is actually a much more accurate description. And the fact that the judge used that language, actually, it's kind of sounding like this judge may be a gun guy. Anyway, the words near the end of Nunley's opinion, it kind of makes me feel a little warm and fuzzy. The fact that even a judge appointed by Barack Hussein Allahu Akbar Obama will faithfully and reasonably apply the law. The statement that really made me get the warm and fuzzies, again, near the end of his opinion, he wrote that the government has an array of policies at its disposal to combat handgun suicide and crime. But the enshrinement of constitutional rights necessarily takes certain policy choices off the table. California may not accomplish its goal by violating the First Amendment. See, that's just awesome. Now, maybe I'm just being a little bit of a geek here. You know, maybe I'm being a little bit of a nerd when it comes to the whole, hey, I'd love to see a judge doing the right thing bit. But for the love of all that's holy in heaven, it gives me the freaking warm and fuzzies, man. And it should you too. I mean, I keep saying an Obama-appointed judge. And there's a reason why I keep wanting to point that out. It's because this guy is not upholding some political agenda. He's not upholding some loyalty to the party. He's actually doing what a federal judge is supposed to do. So, yay. Just yay. All right, going to go ahead right now, play the Edwards Notebook, and then we'll do the Songs and Stories for Soldiers Veterans Tip of the Day. And then after that, we will go ahead and bring you the Kevin Ring interview, and then we'll pick up the show from there. So stay with me. I will be back in just a quick moment. Thanks.
Florida Democrat gubernatorial candidate Andrew Gillum may accuse Republican candidate Ron DeSantis of racism because he used the words monkey up in his warning against voting for the Bernie Sanders anointed candidate. That's pretty sad, but that may be the best the Democrat can offer. Hello, I'm Ron Edwards on today's page from the Edwards Notebook. Think about it. Republican Ron DeSantis wants to further improve Florida's booming economy, reduce burdensome regulations, help protect against illegal immigration, etc. On the other hand, Andrew Gillum, the Democrat, hopes to increase Florida corporate tax rates, force taxpayers to fund a Florida single-payer medical care boondoggle, abolish ICE, and unite Floridians behind open borders. Gillum has already accused DeSantis of being divisive like Trump, because, like Trump, he wants to end illegal immigration. Yep, the leftist Democrat might have a slightly better chance of becoming Florida's governor by screaming racism than by campaigning to slow economic growth, stopping no limits on illegal immigration, and abolishing ICE. I'm Ron Edwards. Join me Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific on AmericaMatters.us and SHR Media. Also Sunday midnights on Talk America Radio Network.
Ron Edwards, the new voice of America.
Sponsored by the Tri-County Liberty Coalition.
All right, real quick before I play the Songs and Stories for Soldiers Veterans Tip of the Day, I did want to thank Ron Edwards one more time for being kind enough to have me on his show this past Friday. If you're not listening to the Ron Edwards Experience, check it out. Fastest 1 hour in radio. Got to spend 2 segments with him last Friday. Great show. And you can find a link to it on my social media pages and at my website over at tappintothetruth.com. That's TAPP intothetruth.com. And just check out the past broadcast page, and you will see that player near the top. In the meanwhile, let's get back to the Songs and Stories for Soldiers Veterans Tip of the Day.
Dan Perkins here with your Songs and Stories for Soldiers.us Veterans Tip of the Day. Would you like medical care quicker from the VA? Of course you would. Here is your Veterans Tip of the Day. The new Veterans Choice Program is one of several programs that allows you to receive care from a community provider, and it's paid for by the VA. If a veteran needs an appointment for a specific type of care and the VA cannot provide that care on a timely basis, or the nearest VA medical facility is too far away or too difficult to get to, then you may be eligible for care through the Veterans Choice Program. Veterans must receive prior authorization from the VA to receive care from a provider that is part of the VA's VCP network of community providers. For a better quality of life, you can start with a simple phone call. This has been Dan Perkins with your Songs and Stories for Soldiers.us Veterans Tip of the Day.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am back. Thanks for staying with me through that very brief break. All right, let me set the stage for you, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, we got to see a circus when it came to the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. Kevin Ring joined me on the initial broadcast of the show. And for those of you who may not be familiar with him, he has been on the show before. So if you're new to the show, you may have heard him somewhere else and not realized it. But Kevin Ring is the president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, better known as FAMM. And he's also the author of Scalia's Court, A Legacy of Landmark Opinions and Dissents. So he is literally an expert on Justice Antonin Scalia. And plus, he is an attorney himself, and he's been working very hard at trying to reform our judicial system. But we had him on primarily to talk about Kavanaugh and the spectacle we saw. So I want to go ahead and play that interview for you now. For those of you who heard it live, thank you for having been there. And again, with the technical glitches, I apologize for having to do this. And for you guys having to sit through something that was less than quality at the time. But that's why I'm going back and doing this. Meanwhile, I'd also like to once again thank Mary and Chief and Gary and Kel and Bigfoot and Bringing It Boy for all being in the chat room and joining me live and being part of that show and interacting with me and with each other. And it was generally a pretty good show with the exception of basically the second half was almost non-existent. And a special thanks to Chief from Simple Facts of Life again for trying to step up and help fill some of that dead air. And like I said, listen at one of the archived platforms for bonus material after the initial 2 hours of the show. I'm leaving that on. I'm attaching it at the end. Just as a hat tip, as a way of saying thanks to Chief. Listen to him completely unprepared, and then look for a show and listen to how he brings it when he is prepared. All right, in the meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Kevin Ring.
It is my pleasure and honor right now to bring back to the show a returning guest, Mr. Kevin Ring. Those of you who have remember or who've been listening for a while, if you're not a brand new listener, you'll remember that we've had discussions previously about mandatory sentencing and the like, and that is because, as well as being the author of the book Scalia's Court, The Legacy of Landmark Opinions and Dissents, which is one of the reasons he's on tonight, he's also the president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and hopefully we'll get him to talk a little bit about that before we're done. But definitely want to talk about Brett Kavanaugh's hearings this past week. So welcome back to the show, Kevin, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's just jump right in. Obviously, you have devoted a lot of time researching, writing about Justice Scalia, who I think most conservatives would see as being one of the sharpest conservative minds on the court, maybe even of all time, certainly of our age. How do you think Brett Kavanaugh matches up to Scalia? And then we'll kind of turn into how things went with the hearings.
I think he's a principled conservative. He's similar in that they both served on the D.C. Circuit, which is considered the second highest court in the land. He stood out as a good writer, which is another Scalia attribute. Was somebody who was able to not only communicate, the right conservative constitutional opinions, but also do it in a way that was clear and concise. And so he's, extremely well qualified. The ABA unanimously said as much. And so I think he compares favorably. Now, I'm biased. I don't think anyone can fill Scalia's shoes. Even Judge Gorsuch hasn't done that to the same extent, but that's because Scalia was a unique justice. But I think Kavanaugh, for those who appreciated Scalia's jurisprudence and way of looking at the Constitution and interpreting federal law, would be happy with Judge Kavanaugh.
Well, that certainly sounds like a pretty good glowing report. I guess that's part of why so many folks on the left really are so dead set against him. Exactly. What is it that you think would be a major hurdle at this point, if there's really any? Because I don't see the Democrats being able to stall for very much longer. I don't see anything that's going to derail this at this point. But is there any concerns you might have based on what we've seen so far?
I don't think so. I think this is over. I think he, like the nominees before him, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, acquitted himself well at his confirmation hearings. I don't think he really had a glove that hit. I think the fact that the Washington Post and others fact checkers are seeing that most of the Democrats' most sort of public attempts to take him down were false means that he's in good shape. And I think at this point it's a pure numbers game. I don't think he's lost any Republican votes, and I think he probably earned himself a couple of Democratic votes. So I don't see anything stopping him from getting onto the court.
Yeah, obviously the left's very desperate. We even had Hillary Clinton take to Twitter and bring back this fact-checked lie about Kavanaugh referring to birth control as abortion-inducing. And we, of course, saw Cory Booker with his I am Spartacus moment, and Kamala Harris trying to force some type of misstep during her line of questioning in regards to what lawyers he may know that works at a law firm. Why do you think there is so much panic on these folks? And have we really moved to a point in time where confirmation hearings really no longer serve a purpose? Because this really just seemed like more posturing for upcoming elections to me than trying to learn about Judge Kavanaugh.
I think you're exactly right. I think it was posturing. I think that's what they've become. I think the fact that President Trump has driven everybody crazy has amped things up. And so you're seeing, just wild attacks. I mean, the craziness. I mean, you saw the white supremacy symbol from the White House lawyer behind him that had to be debunked. I mean, this is some really insane stuff. And then the protesters in the room. I think everyone's just playing to their base. It cannot be that somebody who's viewed as unanimously well qualified from the American Bar Association and served on the second highest court in the land for 12 years is a threat to the republic. It just can't be that. And so I think the lack of proportion, and so therefore the histrionics probably played to Kavanaugh's favor. And I think Justice Scalia said this was coming. This is a guy who was confirmed 98-0, which is impossible to imagine today. But it was a time where if people were qualified and had the right temperament, even if you didn't agree with how they interpret the Constitution, they probably got your vote. Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham from South Carolina, said that at the hearing. He just said, "I voted for Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor. I didn't think they weren't who I would have picked, but I thought they were qualified, and so the president gets his picks. If you want to put people on the court, you got to win the election." We're just not at that point anymore. And Justice Scalia said, the more the Supreme Court butts into the business of everyday life and starts ruling on matters that people otherwise thought they should govern themselves through elections and through the political branches of government like Congress, then they're going to be seen as political actors. And that's what's happened with the court. Now we think of the most, hot button issues, that these are the courts that decide. And so people are viewing these as super elections and these justices as super lawmakers. And so what we want is to win the vote out of these 9 super lawmakers, as opposed to saying they're doing judges' work and their job is to interpret laws, and we give them life tenure so they won't be political. I think for a lot of people that just doesn't wash anymore. They just think it's in the bag, and you just want to win the power struggle. So I think so all norms and customs of how this process works are gone. Yeah, and it really is a shame, because it's just one more step further towards the loss of civility. Our politics are just so predominant in the thought process that people can't get outside of their own heads. They're so busy about trying to win without much thought. But do you see a time coming, especially if Donald Trump stays in office and manages to get reelected,
which I think is a high possibility myself. I use the term manages because sometimes I think that if anyone's going to stop Donald Trump, it's probably going to be Donald Trump. But if he decides to go forward and continue, do you see one, maybe even two more justices? And then with the folks that are on his list, and as long as he stays with that list, could we possibly get back to a Supreme Court that actually treats the court the way it's supposed to instead of playing right into this we're super legislator model?
I don't know. I'm not optimistic because I think it's moved in one direction, and it's hard for me to see how this goes back. You just sort of can't put that toothpaste back in the tube where the court is going to now start saying, this isn't our business, we're going to leave this to Congress or the state legislatures. It just seems like now both sides, when they're losing, want the court to bail them out. And so I'm afraid I'm not optimistic that people are going to ask for a court that stays within its bounds. And as long as that's the case, we're going to see confirmation hearings like these, which are very political. And this is a sign right across the country. I mean, in other areas, not just the Supreme Court, of just incredible politicization of everything. I mean, everything is hypercharged right now. And I know there are people in these communities, and because of some of the issues that are, at the forefront today involving immigration, people feel like this is an existential crisis and all the rest. But everything is amped. Everything's at 10. It's net neutrality. It's tax cuts. Everything's at 10. And I hope that things simmer down. But I worry about it because I think if everybody has a grievance, right? The resistance, they're not going to work with Trump on anything. And the Democrats say, well, when Obama was president, Mitch McConnell said, my job is to make him a one-term president. And the Republicans say, oh, yeah, but you remember what you did to Robert Bork. And, it's like everybody has a grievance that just frees them from any sort of good behavior. And the whataboutism of, well, I'm free now to the ends justify the means because you've done something that I can point to, and whether it's proportional or not. So I worry. I worry that it's going to be hard to move back.
Right. Well, I certainly understand your viewpoint, and I agree for the most part as far as the temperature of the country is concerned, because I know it happens on both sides. There are a lot of conservatives that want every Supreme Court ruling to come down their side, so they want a 7-2, an 8-1. They'd love to have a 9-0 control. But by rights, if the court's working the way it's supposed to, you should probably never have a 9-0 unless it is absolutely just obviously unconstitutional. But beyond that, isn't this really sort of outside of the hands of what the people want? If you nominate and then manage to get confirmed textualists and originalists on that court, doesn't the court itself take care of that because they don't have to worry about what the people are going to say and do as long as they're actually falling within what the constitutional guidelines of what a Supreme Court justice should and behave?
Yeah, although I think people disagree about what the Constitution, how it should be interpreted, right? I mean, you got a theory that it's a living Constitution and should evolve with the times, and it's not clear what that means. I mean, for some people, like Justice Scalia would say, yeah, it evolves in the sense of the First Amendment was written when there wasn't, computers and blogs and internet, so certainly it can cover those things. Other people just mean, no, it just espouses values, and those should just be shaped by the times, and the court is best situated to figure out what those values are. So, I mean, we do have deep differences about how the Constitution should be interpreted. So that's very real. But, I mean, one of the points you were making is you're right that just because you care about something in a policy sense doesn't mean that the Constitution is always on your side and that every Supreme Court decision should come down on your favor. Justice Scalia famously voted to strike down a statute that would ban flag burning. And he said, I don't have any love for sandal-wearing, bearded, scruffy flag burners, but I think that's core political speech protected by the First Amendment. And so my policy preference doesn't matter. And he used to say of those on the other side, it must be easy to be them because they wake up every day and the Constitution agrees with everything they say. And so that's the problem. If that's your theory, that whatever you want must obviously be constitutional, then these fights are going to mean a lot more to you.
Right. Well, I can't agree with you more as far as the point you're making. You're absolutely dead on. And yeah, what I do want in a Supreme Court justice is someone who is going to stand on the principle, even if the principle is contrary to what they would prefer. I think that's the ultimate sign of integrity for someone who's going to sit on any bench. And it's probably one of the hardest things that somebody could do, especially if it's an assault on your core beliefs. But your job is your job, and you took the oath. As far as interpreting the Constitution as a living document, though, I think it kind of equates to language has a way of changing over time. And if in the Constitution, for example, they said that chickens shall forever be protected and never eaten, just some crazy example. And then 175 years later, somehow the word chicken has evolved into the word dog. We should look at the context in which it was written to understand what it meant at the time. I think while the language may change, the intention really doesn't. And I know that's still at the core of the basic argument, but I wonder, do you think that particular argument is far-fetched, or is there some merit to that?
No, I think it's right. And I mean, he doesn't want to tie himself to the definition or how it was understood in, 1785 because he just thinks that was a particularly good year. It's just like, if you're not tied to something, then it can mean anything. And, I know people think, well, no, these are just values that are being espoused. Even if you believe that, who do you think is the best person to interpret those values in the modern era? A majority of 9, 70, and 80-year-old justices, who live in Washington, D.C. and went to the same school? I mean, are these the people you think have their finger on the pulse of what the American people believe about certain things? I mean, that can't be right. I mean, certainly the legislature is more in tune with current values and sort of morals and instincts of what the people want. And so, you tie yourself to something because we have a written Constitution. If you just wanted things to just be complete common law where we just make up the law as we go along, you could definitely have that. But our framers put a Constitution down to say certain things are down. And if we want to change that, they put in a mechanism for changing the Constitution. Otherwise, if you don't tether yourself to something, then you're floating.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Well, again, I want to thank you for your time this evening, sir. Obviously, we're going to have to start wrapping it up because I know you have some other stuff to do. But before we let you go, again, remind everybody again about FAMM. Let them know about your work.
Sure.
Give them any websites you'd like to give out. And if you invite people to follow you on social media, throw that out as well.
Sure. FAMM is a national criminal justice reform organization. We oppose sort of one-size-fits-all sentences and one-size-fits-all prison policies, and it's sometimes considered unorthodox for conservatives to oppose mandatory sentencing. But we believe that judges, in our separation of powers, in the system that we have, judges are supposed to do the judging and imposing punishments. Congress is supposed to do its job and just decide what's unlawful, and then the executive is supposed to enforce the law. In our system today, we've given prosecutors way too much authority, not only to pick the charges, bring charges, try cases, but also, because of mandatory minimums, to essentially pick the sentence. That's too much authority for one actor in our system to have, even prosecutors who, by and large, try to do a good job. And so, our fight is really to restore the constitutional system, to allow for checks and balances. People should come to our website at famm.org, FAMM.org, to see what the consequence of this unbalance has caused. Real harm for families in this country, where people who make mistakes deserve to be held accountable are being punished to a point where it's destroying families and communities. And it's something we can correct, keep us safe and still, and fix these laws.
All right. Obviously worthwhile, and I can't tell you how much that means that there are folks still out here fighting for principle. Again, where can they find your book? I'm sure there's still some folks that haven't gotten a copy yet of Scalia's Court. Certainly worthwhile read.
I haven't sold 320 million copies yet, so there are probably still some Americans who have not bought it, and they can do so at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or, local bookstore.
All right. Any closing thoughts you'd like to depart on?
No, I thank you for the time, allowing me to talk both about the court and about FAMM's important work, and I appreciate it.
All right. And again, I appreciate your time this evening. Thank you. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again soon.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Kevin Ring.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was indeed Kevin Ring, president of FAMM and author of the Scalia's Court. Certainly a interesting conversation, I thought, even though sitting back and listening to myself, it's obvious. It's a good thing that these folks know how to carry an interview because, anyway, just a little self-critiquing. Let's move on. All right, now that was a pretty good interview. We moved forward, and from that point on, the show was completely shot. Now, one of the things that I did different from the originals, I went more in depth about the story involving the SmackDown of Kamala Harris's DOJ gun case. Went into much more detail because I was in a race against the clock. So having a little more time, I played a little more in depth with that, and we talked about it more. But here was the next scheduled story, and we'll just go from here. How many of you guys are actually familiar with D.C. McAllister? She is a news personality, and she is a contributor at the Daily Wire and PJ Media. Well, after posting a rather strong pro-life message on Twitter last week, the journalist and commentator, D.C. McAllister, ended up having to contact police and step away from social media because of a series of, as it's being described, legitimate death and rape threats, including threats directed at her family. Now, this situation began with a tweet by McAllister that she posted last week criticizing what she's calling the abortion hysteria. Now, obviously, we've seen and heard all this. The leftists have really lost their mind. They think Kavanaugh is going to end Roe versus Wade. They think it's going to end the whole abortion on demand industry, which sadly I don't think he will. The first and foremost, guys, you leftists out there that all in a tizzy, a case that might actually challenge the precept would have to make its way through the courts before that would even matter. And I haven't seen anything like that right now. But anyway, I digress. McAllister was talking about the abortion hysteria. In fact, let me go ahead and read you the quote of her tweet. She said, "At the root of the hashtag abortion hysteria is women's unhinged desire for irresponsible sex. Sex is their god. Abortion is their sacrament." She also added, "It's abhorrent as women have flung themselves from the heights of being the world's civilizing force to the muck and mire of dehumanizing depravity." Now, those are pretty strong words. I see nothing dishonest about it. I see nothing that's inaccurate about it, although the leftists go, "Oh, abortion is right. It's my body, man, and that you're just a crazy woman." Only she is a woman, so she has some room to discuss the topic. She can see through your BS. Most people with half a brain can. This whole idea that for some reason you should have a right to murder an unborn child because you don't want to live with the repercussions of your actions, because you can't possibly be responsible enough, even though you're adult enough, to go out and commit the acts that led to your pregnancy. Well, it is abhorrent. It's immoral, it's abhorrent, and it's ridiculous that there's such a strong sentiment about trying to protect this. You're worried about Donald J. Trump saying something that hurts someone's feelings, but it's perfectly okay to just go around murdering unborn children. And no one should challenge your right to say it? This is what she said. This is what she said. And it's strong words. And I want to stand up and applaud her for having tweeted that. She makes solid points about how women used to be the voice of reason. How women were the main reason why men wanted to behave better. I find myself somewhat offended, but unable to argue against the point when you look at the historical context. And it's not so much today. Today, these same leftist women, these third-wave feminists, and now the fourth-wave feminists coming along, have basically wussed down most young men to the point that you can't even tell they're men. In fact, it seems like they have trouble telling themselves, hence this gender fluidity issue. But let me ask you, those strong words, are those strong words worthy of death threats? Are those strong words worthy of threats to rape Miss McAllister? Or to threaten her family, her children? I mean, you want to talk about the potential of violence from people on the right. When it's the folks on the left that are so unhinged and are willing to commit acts of violence at the drop of a hat, for crying out loud, Teen Vogue, like we mentioned at the top of the show, is out here telling high school kids how they can get involved with a domestic terrorist organization that wants to wear a mask and wants to attack people who aren't even looking. Because have you ever watched a video where they literally got in their face and the attack came from the person they were face to face with? Because I haven't. It's always a sucker punch from somewhere from the back. Always a bike chain flying from around the crowd from somebody that you weren't looking at, that are 3 people away and can still bounce away before you can get your hands back on them. They have to do these tactics because most of them are such a ridiculous punk butt, instead of the word I was going to say, since this is going to be aired on radio, terrestrial radio. I don't want to get the FCC coming after me. It's a bad thing. Let's just say they know the tactic is to stay away, because if a real person capable of defending themselves got their hands on them, they would break most of them like twigs. Because remember, at their heart, most of these people are still whining because their feelings are hurt. But here's the situation. Along with the expected outrage, all the keyboard warriors, all the social justice warriors on Twitter, that she knew was going to just become epileptic with this. All the outrage from the pro-abortion crowd. McAllister, who happens to be a rape survivor, revealed that she began to receive threats outside of Twitter. Now, it's these outside of Twitter threats that really worried her and her family enough that she felt compelled to contact the authorities. Now, according to PJ Media, they reported that McAllister told them that she received death and rape threats over multiple forms of private communication. There are threats outside of Twitter stating that they know where I live, threats of rape and strangling. I spoke to the police. I'm on home watch. My children are very frightened. She literally has to have the police watching her house now to make sure somebody doesn't try to break in and follow through with these threats, meaning that the police certainly think that these are viable threats. Now, she posted about the threats this past Sunday, saying, quote, I am facing legit death and rape threats because I have dared to call out women who are hysterical about abortion and to challenge them to be responsible and not to elevate sex to the point that they're willing to kill human life to avoid their responsibilities. How sick is that? This is one of the last things she posted on social media. She had to step away. In an interview with the Daily Wire, McAllister lamented the deterioration of honest debate in our culture in the face of such mobbish behavior. She said, quote, "It's sad that conservatives who speak out for fundamental values of Western civilization are threatened and sometimes silenced by the mob. This is what it looks like to live in the jungle. There's no reasoning together, no debate, no discussion in the public square. When you no longer believe that individuals are made in the image of God and have innate dignity, you no longer value their right to speak or even live. Others are just tools to promote your own agenda." Again, very powerful words. D.C. McAllister seems to have a knack for it. Now, the situation, she suggested, is the inevitable result of an increasing embrace of relativism and self-centeredness. She said, quote, "This is what happens when you abandon objective truth and values. Your own ideas, urges, and subjective views become the standard for all. Because you've abandoned reason, you're left with only power and force to convince others of your truth. And your truth is the only truth that matters." I added that. It's a frightening age in which we live. All we can do is continue to hold the line of reason and morality against the mob and support one another in the struggle that the left has created. They want to divide us, isolate us, and if we let that happen, we're lost. Now, McAllister also discussed her decision to contact the police. She said, quote, "Having a police presence in the situation has been helpful, and I advise anyone who finds themselves in this situation to call the police. Get a private investigator if you can. You might not always be able to discover who's behind the threats, but you can deter behavior and send out a warning that you won't tolerate this kind of hatred." You won't tolerate this kind of hatred. That's where we're at, ladies and gentlemen. We're at a point in time where we do need to be sending that message. We're at a point in time where the mob mentality, not just on social media, but in public now, thanks to domestic terrorist groups like Antifa, thanks to the leftist agenda being pushed, shoved down our throats through most forms of mainstream media, the news outlets, Hollywood, magazines like Teen Vogue, we're under constant attack and we're under constant scrutiny. Today, on Twitter, and I don't spend much time on Twitter, but I felt the need today. Usually when I am on Twitter, I'm just sharing links and what have you. I spend way more time on Gab and now over at Hubbook and still over at teapartycommunity.com. Great social media alternatives. Have an account over at MeWe. Still don't have much in the way of followers over there. Still trying to figure out really how all that works there. But I took to Twitter because Twitter today decided that it has a fundamental problem with the term illegal alien. Illegal alien is now somehow a violation of the community standards. So I took to Twitter and I simply said, "Attention Twitter. Illegal alien," and I put that in quotes, "is a legal term to describe someone who's entered a nation in an unlawful fashion. It is not a derogatory term. It is not hate speech. It is a legal description, and often an accurate description. That is all. And it should be that simple. But the pushback is there. Several conservatives that follow me gave it the big heart and reposted, retweeted, and then the leftist mob saw it, and suddenly I'm a bigot. I'm one of the worst pieces of... Although what I did was nothing compared to what some other conservatives did on Twitter. I don't even remember who it was, but I saw it earlier. And about all they did was put up illegal aliens, blah, blah. I just kept putting, just daring Twitter to do the banning thing. Of course, shadow banning is a real thing, and it happens. Anyway. The mob mentality is there. It's real. It exists. And the virtue signaling. Again, I've said it before. I will say it again. I'm going to say it right now. More often than not, boys and girls, you little social justice warriors that you out there, you keyboard warriors, you keyboard tough guys, when you have to virtue signal, often you're signaling that you have no real virtue. You're not prepared to stand up for a principle. You don't know the facts. You want emotion to win the day because that's how you were won over yourself. Somebody convinced you because they made an emotional plea, and you don't want to hurt someone else's feelings. You don't want your feelings to be hurt. But guess what? Facts don't care about your feelings. Reality is not a fun place to be all the time. Life, it's not fair, and it doesn't care about what microaggressions you're facing today. Because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? I've said this a bunch too. If you're concerned about a microaggression, then you probably haven't faced any real adversity. Because I'll tell you what, the folks who have seen the real thing, they don't waste their time worrying about microaggressions. I mean, when you really stop and think about it, if we have really gotten our society to a point that the biggest thing you have to worry about is a microaggression, then we're so much better off than we were before. We just got to get you folks, they're the ones that are actually worried about the microaggressions, to grow the heck up. It's time for you to grow up and move on. You're past it. You cannot make death threats against someone in their family because they say something you don't like on a platform you think you own. And Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, you've all got to make some serious choices and some decisions about how you're going to handle yourselves moving forward. Because either you are a platform or you are a publisher. Either you are letting us be responsible for our own content, or you're responsible for our content. And when you make those decisions, and you make them once and for all, you need to hold everyone to the same standard. If you're going to kick Alex Jones off, I sure as heck better be seeing Al-Qaeda accounts being knocked off. There should be no Al-Qaeda on social media. But they're there. There should be no ISIS on social media. But they're there. There should be no Antifa on social media. But they're there. There should be no Nation of Islam on social media. But they're there. And they're not the problem. They're not a threat. They're like the Pope. Right now, the Catholic Church, despite everything they're facing, the biggest challenge they're really facing is the fact that for a little while now, they've had the least Catholic Pope ever. But our media wants to protect this guy. They want to look the other way when he says things like, the proper answer to this situation is silence. No, it's not. The proper answer to your priest sexual dalliances cover-up story would have been to get out in front of it. Go public yourself. Admit there was wrongdoing. Start kicking some of these people out of the priesthood, making efforts at some type of restitution before there's even a court thing. Do not worry about lawsuits. Do not worry about doing what's right. That would be the way to deal with it. Do not blame the accuser as being a force for Satan. But the only thing not leftist about this Pope is the fact that at least publicly he still says he's got an opposition against abortion. Everything else, though, is uber leftist. So the mainstream media, they look at him and they say, this guy's one of ours. We've got to protect him. If this had been Pope Paul John, it just would have been the end of the world. The Catholic Church would be getting decimated in our media here in the States, but it's not. In fact, they played it off like it was words of wisdom. He's probably right. The great accuser is behind this. Know who's behind this? There's these priests that committed these acts of heinous and lewd behavior, who victimized young children, and whom high-ranking members at the Vatican were aware, possibly even you yourself, based on everything from what we've seen and heard. And it casts such a dark shadow over the rest of the church and the church membership. And unfortunately, a lot of the members are in a position where they have to take the tribal position. This is an organization that I'm a part of. This is my team. And my team's being attacked by those guys. The Protestants are coming after us. We've got to stand up for our team. And, we'll worry about fixing things later. But we're not going to let you attack our... You can understand the behavior, but it puts them in a bad spot. Because now they're in a position where they're having to not defend the actions, but still defend the people behind the actions. This Pope is terrible. The Catholic Church is in trouble. And a lot of folks are really, really getting negative towards the organization that weren't before. But all that said and done, let me switch gears again. Now, there is a situation that's still going on our southern border. A situation that would probably be greatly alleviated if we, had something like a wall, maybe, along the border, to make it a little more difficult for people to just, walk across or swim across at certain places. I mean, we have this situation. Now, we're still being told constantly by the leftist media that this doesn't even happen at all. But there's video footage from a ranch in Arizona that shows thousands of illegal aliens. Oh no, Twitter's coming after me. I said illegal aliens. Footage in Arizona, thousands of illegal aliens marching into the United States uninterrupted because there's no border wall, no border patrol, nothing like that there to stop them. Now, Jim Shelton, 79 years old, he owns a 50,000-acre ranch that's situated on the United States-Mexico border, which has basically become a hot spot for illegals to just come on across. Welcome to America, boys and girls. Can you speak any English? It doesn't matter. We'll use taxpayer dollars to provide you services in your native tongue. Now, he'd set up security cameras, and the security camera footage from as recently as this year shows individuals in camouflage toting large backpacks, and in some cases, what certainly appears to most reasonable observers to be military-style assault rifles, walking through his ranch into the states incident-free. They even attached the military-style assault rifles to horses. Now, I don't know why we insist on referring to these as military-style assault rifles, except for the fact that these actually are full autos. Okay? It's not an AR-15 we're talking about. We're talking about full automatic stuff. Anyway, certain shots show illegal aliens pouring into the country literally by the dozen. And according to the Los Angeles Times, Chilton carries a pistol and a rifle while tending his cattle, basically to try to ward off the drug smugglers who encroach on his land. According to the article, Chilton says that he does not know why the border hasn't been fortified by his property, saying, quote, although he respects the Border Patrol agents in the region, he said he doesn't understand why they won't fortify and build a substantial border fence along the region, including the 5 miles of international boundary alongside his ranch. It's inhuman, he said, to allow border crossers to walk in easily through the border, putting their lives at risk from cold nights and hot days, and many are apprehended further inland anyway. So basically he's saying a lot of these folks are getting caught. I don't think he realizes a lot of them aren't getting caught. I mean, we're doing better. We're doing a lot better, but thanks to the Democrats and their dramatics at the border, and you're separating children from their families. Oh, drama, boo-hoo. Thanks to all those antics, and the fact that for some strange reason there's still a tremendous number of pamphlets roaming around through Central and parts of South America from the Obama days that explains how to come to the U.S. and how to apply for food stamps. Of course, it's technically the SNAP program, but that's what it is. Here's the best way to get here, and as soon as you're here, this is what you do, and you'll get free stuff. Those pamphlets are still just floating around. But he's got a point, though. It is inhumane. When you consider, and we've talked about this before, the whole notion that these people that are coming across the border are facing the type of obstacles and types of situations that it's unsafe. They're putting themselves at risk, and the ones that are coming with minors are putting those children at risk. That takes us back to the separation of the children and why we should even be concerned about that. I mean, when we come across parents living in a home with their children, but they're also using their home to cook meth, the children are taken away, and often the parents go to jail. We don't send the kids to the prison with the parents. That's inhumane. So if we will take citizens' children and separate them when they've committed a crime, why wouldn't we do the same thing? And again, I'm going to point out, and I've been pointing this out for a while, a few other folks started pointing this out. Now it's kind of been lost again because the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about it. And a lot of conservative outlets have gotten tired of being the only voices telling you. So I guess it's up to me. A statistically significant percentage of adults bringing children with them across the border, once tested, turns out not only is this not their child, it's not their nephew, it's not their niece, it's not their cousin. There's literally no relation. There's still a thriving industry going on in parts of Central and South America where would-be coyotes are going around literally purchasing children from poor farmers. They're given this promises like, Here, there's your opportunity to have more money than you'll ever have in your life otherwise. And your kid's going to America. So your child's going to have the greatest life ever. They will thank you for this in the end. If you really cared about these children, you would want to put policy in place that did not encourage this kind of thing. Let's get back to some freaking common sense, shall we? You're not an asylum seeker if you're caught illegally crossing our border. You are claiming you're an asylum seeker because you got caught. That's rule number one. We need to establish rules of common sense and border. Do not offer these people a hearing on their status as an asylum seeker. They're not seeking asylum. The legal way to come seek asylum is to come through a legal point of entry and request it. Or, if you can't quite get to our legal points of entry, go to an embassy or a consulate. We tend to have several of those throughout many of the countries in which these people are trying to flee from. It would be easy to do. Now, let's also return to common sense in granting asylum. Because guess what? Simple criminal offenses, simple issues of local law enforcement are not grounds for asylum. I'm a poor woman with 2 children under the age of 3, and my husband is abusive. That's a bad situation. My heart goes out to you. But that's something you need to deal with at the local level. It's not our place. Now, it sounds heartless. It sounds cold. I know. But again, I'll make the statement, facts don't care about your feelings. And asylum is supposed to be for people that are in legitimate danger of their lives for political purposes. The fact that you have a legal issue at home and that your law enforcement sucks, that's not our fault. So it's not our responsibility. Although I would not be opposed to the U.S. government finding a way to help improve law enforcement in nations near our borders. Because it would still serve American interest as well as helping to make them better and stronger and law and order abiding neighbors, which also is a good thing. So I wouldn't be opposed to that, especially if you could find a way to do it that wouldn't necessarily cost a lot of money. But I would be willing to pay pretty much whatever we're losing right now, giving benefits to illegal aliens. Come get me, Twitter. Illegal aliens, illegal aliens. At any rate, back to the story here in the Arizona ranch. Among the people that are casually crossing the border, they include members of drug cartels, they include mules and human smugglers known as coyotes. The ranch owner himself says that he has noticed a recent uptick in the number of individuals using his ranch to enter the country. Now, part of that is probably having to do with the fact that Trump and company have been increasing increasing border patrol in certain areas. But at the end of all this stuff, it still comes down to a very simple fact. Common sense must be the rule of the day. Law and order must be established and maintained. You're not doing these children any favors if you leave them in the hands of people who are willing to endanger them. You wouldn't leave them in the hands of citizens here in this country if they were endangering the children. In fact, lots of you are in a hurry to take away children far too quickly, I think, more than not. From families where they're not really endangered, but there's the perception that they're endangered, that somehow the parents aren't quite doing enough, even if they're doing the best they can. Now, every situation like that is different and unique, and there are occasions when obviously children should not be left with their parents. But my point is, we're real quick to pull the trigger there. The bleeding hearts and the social workers are like, oh, you don't support little Jenny's desire to be transgender, so you're a bad parent, and we're gonna take him for you. Or you don't support little Jennifer's right to go seek birth control or to go get an abortion, even though they're a minor. And you, as the parent, we shouldn't even have to notify you. We should just go take care of this. You guys are really, really willing to intervene in cases like that. But then when it comes to someone dragging a kid through the desert, freezing temperatures at night, burning hot temperatures during the day, rattlesnakes left and right, well, these are just hardworking, decent folks. They're criminals by definition. You know, that's the one thing you guys you never can seem to wrap your mind around. They are criminals. They cross the border illegally. They are criminals. That's what the whole illegal means. And quite frankly, there's enough of them at this point with zero intention of trying to become American citizens. I think a legitimate argument can and should be made that it's an invasion. We're facing an invasion from various people. But the one thing that the left still, they want to hammer you away at, and I'm gonna use this rhetoric here because this rhetoric is still factual. It is the facts, and again, the facts don't care about your feelings. But at the bottom, underneath all this, the overwhelming majority of conservatives in this country want these people to have healthy, productive lives where they can feel safe. Many of them are willing to give them a pass, although I would contend they shouldn't, but many of them are willing to give them a pass on breaking that first law, coming here illegally. It's what they do after that. Not every border crosser happens to be an economic migrant. Some of them are smuggling drugs. Some of them are slipping into Phoenix to kidnap someone so they can ransom them back and use that money to help fuel their cartel or their gun running. When it comes to controlling the border, it's not about stopping immigration. It's about implementing common sense immigration. It's not about telling people they can't come here, that they can't have part of the American dream. It's about telling people that they can have the American dream, and the American dream still means something. It's about telling people that if they want a part of the American dream, here's the way you do it. Respect it enough to do it the right way. It's about telling people that we want to know who you are before we let you in. We want to make sure you are who you say you are. It's called vetting. This goes back to President Donald Trump's travel restriction executive order. It was about establishing better vetting. It was never about saying no Muslim will ever be allowed to come back in the States. Now, it was attempted to be implemented poorly, and they had some problems and blah, and you can make whatever argument you want to. But at the end of the day, when you actually look at what it says, when you actually look at the very beginning of it, this was about establishing the idea that nobody just waltzes in here without us really knowing who you are. That way, we can offer some level of protection to our citizens. That way, we don't run the risk of when we do accept asylum seekers from places like Syria, that the very terrorists they're trying to escape from don't end up right beside them in the same settlement. What good does it do to remove these people from this bad situation if all we do is bring that same bad situation to our own shore? They're not any better off, and now we're worse off. We put ourselves in a position where we can no longer help others. What was the point? Well, that's going to have to be it for tonight. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, don't take my word for it. Definitely don't take their word for it. Be prepared to put in some effort and to use your brain if you really want to tap into the truth. Thoughts and prayers going out to the folks facing down with the incoming hurricane. Please check out patriotmusic.com when you get a chance. And check out Tap Into the Truth while you're at it. TAPP Into the Truth. Good night and thanks.
Smell the dust, feel the sun, fingers twitch just above the gun. Hear the wind across the plain. There is no fear that I must contain. And I'm in the eye of the hurricane. I see the sweat across his brow. I'm poised to draw in eternal now. The fastest one is the one who's slain. I still stand, got the better aim. And I'm in the eye of the hurricane. And I want the world to know my pain. And I want the wind to say my name. 'Cause I'm in the eye of the hurricane. I was passing through on my way back home to get a drink, but be left alone. They tried to take my guns, some mayor's new campaign. I told them I would leave, they pushed me just the same. And I'm in the eye of the hurricane. I want the world to know my pain. And I want the wind to say my name. 'Cause I'm in the eye of the hurricane.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is Matt Fitzgibbon. He is a great musician. He's a fantastic historian and also a good friend of the show. So again, let me ask you to please visit and check out patriotmusic.com whenever you get a chance and check him frequently. He's always working on new projects and he's adding new merchandise. And he's got some really cool merchandise too, I must say. Like I mentioned earlier, Now we're into the bonus section. So the folks listening to KYAH 540 AM, Utah's Talk Authority, you won't get to hear this part unless you've searched out the archived version of the show. But everybody else, this is right here. This is my hat tip to Chief from Simple Facts of Life, as he made every effort to step up during the original live airing, where I was basically just about completely locked out of the show, except I could turn on and off his microphone because he was actually listening in from the switchboard. So I'm going to play that so that you can get a little bit of a feel of what he was doing, improvising, and hopefully you'll come to realize, if that's what he's like, improvising, maybe he's worth giving a listen to when he's prepared to rock and roll. So this is Chief from Simple Facts of Life, trying to set in and cover for me while I had dead air. Chief, again, thank you, and this is my hat tip to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. This is Chief from Simple Facts of Life Radio. Tim is still having some issues, but I was on the phone, so I let him know, and he put me on just to fill the little dead air. We have, how much time do we have left of the show? Not very much. Didn't have anything particular to talk about. You can, of course, if you want to hear me speak in a more prepared fashion, I'm on at 9 p.m. Pacific Sunday nights. And some of the things that Tim was talking about earlier, something I talked about last Sunday night, and it had to do with the economy and President Obama now trying to take credit for what's happened. Let me give you a clue here. If you say it can't happen, like, well, those jobs aren't coming back. Donald Trump have some kind of magic wand or what? If that's what you say, then, okay, looks like my microphone is turned back on. Like I was saying, if you say it can't happen, now had President Obama said back during the election, said, I don't think Donald Trump's policies are going to work to bring back the economy, but my policies will. Well, at least then he could have said, well, it looks like, President Trump did what I said he should do, and so I'll take some credit for it. That's not what he said. He said it couldn't be done. And now he tries to take credit for it. That's about as ridiculous as it gets. And that is a simple fact of life. And now, Tim, I just saw on the chat board, Tim can't seem to get out. You know your phone number. It's right on your screen. Just call your phone number like you did last time. Of course, if he does that, he's probably called on the phone, and then he ends up knocking himself off. Yeah, I've had these problems before. But let me see. I'm just looking at my computer screen, and what time? I don't know. What time are we? Okay, we've only got about 9 minutes till the show automatically ends anyway. Of course, I don't have 9 minutes worth of stuff to talk about. So it's too bad Mary was on the phone earlier, but she left. So otherwise, you could have turned. Anybody just called into the number, and maybe Tim will put you on, and we can do a show without him. Let me see. What else was he going on? Let me go back in the chat room here and see what we were. Yeah, what we had here. Can't see how far back we can get. Yeah, can't get all the way. But I'm trying to go back to what we were talking about earlier. And I want to look at the show notes up here because there was something. It has to do with, yes, socialism. Earlier we were talking about something Tim was saying in the chat room, Jim Carrey. Yes, just embrace socialism. Well, Jim, I got an idea. Why don't you just write a check to Bernie Sanders for all of your money? You see, here's the way it works with people like that. They have a lot of money. They don't care how much the rest of us are taxed because they live above the pricing scheme. If they have enough money, they can afford if the prices go way up. But you get people, like me, like you, maybe work for a job, have a little income. But if we have to pay for the people who don't want to work for a living, and that costs us money, that affects our lifestyle. All these Hollywood liberal types or some of the liberal industrial types, their lifestyle is not going to be affected. If prices go up, what do they care? They'll pay more. But their quality of life is not going to be affected in any way, shape, or form. But if, for instance, reminds me of remember a few years ago there was an interview in France, I believe, with Will Smith. Was talking about, it's all a good idea, and someone, you're willing to pay 75% tax, and he, what, 70? Wait, what? Yeah, they're willing to pay, say, 50%, as long as the rest of us pay 50%, because 50% of their money really isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. Because contrary to what the liberals would have you believe, that 1% of the highest earner really don't control 90% of the wealth. So 50% of the 1%'s money is not going to make a dent in things. 50% of the rest of our money, that will make a dent. But it will also make a dent in how we live, how often we can take a vacation, what kind of car we drive, what we eat, where we live. These rich Hollywood guys, they have more money than they know what to do with. So therefore, they are outside of the pricing situation. So that's it. Let me see where I'm just looking at my clock. We'll have to all come over to Discord there and get in their chat room. I may do that right after the show. Of course, again, I don't even know for sure if anybody can hear me, but I did hear my microphone being unmuted, and when that happens, I just start talking. And that's it. So I don't know. Yeah, in the chat room, can anybody actually still hear me? Is anybody listening? I'm not getting any whole lot of feedback from what I am saying. They're all talking about where they want to go from here. So I don't even know if I'm going out. But I'm not hearing anything. I'm not seeing anything. Gary hears me. Okay. Well, then I'm glad to know that I'm embarrassing myself in front of the whole world with my ramblings, and not just me, not just embarrassing myself in my own little room. And we are down to the last few minutes of the show. Tim, if you can hear it, anytime you want. If you start playing the music, I will say good. Turn the volume down, play it low. I know you got about a 3-minute song you can play for. So if you play the music, I'll sign off for you. I heard something.
Actually, I am back on, I think, finally. But I want to thank you, Chief. All right, I want to thank you, Chief, for stepping in. Thank you very much and covering. I got completely locked out, but I appreciate you helping. And, guys, thanks for your patience and for staying in there. Bigfoot, Gary, and yourself for staying with the show at this point, and I certainly appreciate it. I obviously am going to have to go back and do some editing, but wow, BTR really let me down today. Well, actually, I'm looking at just getting rid of the empty dead air, but again, thanks, Chief. I appreciate it. And that will have to be it for tonight, guys. Thank you very much. And remember, don't take my word for it. Definitely don't take my word for it. Be prepared. Be prepared to put in some effort. And remember to use your brain if you really want to tap into the truth. Thanks again, Chief. This is Miracle for my friend Cash Eslo, because if I stay on BTR at this point, it's going to be a miracle. Good night, everybody, and thanks.
All right. At this point, I am going to go ahead and play Miracle from my friend Cash Eslo, and I want to thank Cash again for letting me to use his tune, too, as I think it's still apropos. But one more time, thank you, anybody who's listened to the bonus material. I hope you have some clue as to, first of all, how embarrassing it is to me to get locked out of my own show. But I also really, really appreciate Chief for just stepping in cold, unprepared, and trying to stay on the topics that I had laid out. It's not like these were his topics. It's not like he was ready to go to do this, but he just, and he's great about this. Lots of times he'll be on the phone lines listening in. And if something happens, as long as you can get him unmuted, he's willing to keep the party going, so to speak. And you can tell even in that limited role with no prep whatsoever, he still managed to get 2 really great topics out, and he made a lot of great common sense, and it really laid out some simple facts of life. So, like I said, let me encourage you again to go check out Simple Facts of Life, his show. He is prepared. It's a whole different ballgame when you hear that, and it's definitely worthwhile. So thank you again, Chief. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. But we are going to sign out now. So this is going to be the end of the bonus contact, but I am going to play Miracle for my friend Cash Eslo. Otherwise, this is going to be it for tonight, guys, and thanks for... Thanks for listening to the bonus content. Have a great evening, and I will return. Maybe not on BTR, but I'll be back.
I'm looking for a miracle. Looking for a miracle. Angel looking over me. Just a breath of hope to see. I'm looking for a miracle. Looking for a miracle. Open up the doors for me. Looking forward to eternity. I were you and you were me, and we were us and us were we. Maybe we find room to see the miracle. Say once more, the miracle. Everybody needs a miracle, a little love to spread upon